In the fall of 2002, a large suitcase was found near Vancouver's Stave Lake. Inside lay the body of a bright 21-year-old Chinese student, Zhao Wei. Her boyfriend, Li Ang, shed tears on TV, begging for help to find her. But those tears held dark secrets. What started as a missing person case would spiral into an international scandal spanning 2 decades. The son of a powerful Beijing family, a staged disappearance, and a justice system that seemed to bend for the privileged. Today, we uncover how Liang escaped justice not once, but 3 times, first fleeing Canada with police escort, then manipulating China's courts to reduce his sentence from life to just 7 years, and finally creating a new identity to build a life in New Zealand. Watch as we reveal how a murderer used wealth, connections, and calculated lies to repeatedly slip through the cracks of justice. From faking asylum claims to infiltrating Tibet's independence movement, Li Ang's story shows the terrifying lengths some will go to escape their past. But at the heart of this tale is Zhao Wei, a young woman whose dreams were cut short, and her parents, who still fight for justice 20 years later. This is a story that will make you question everything about privilege, justice, and how far someone will go to escape their crimes. If this story moves you, please hit like and share it with others. Subscribe to join us in exposing more cases where justice takes a backseat to power and privilege. Every share helps shine a light on stories that some would rather keep in the dark. Picture a young woman with an infectious smile and bright eyes full of dreams and ambitions. At just 21, Zhao Wei embodied everything youth should be: vibrant, determined, and ready to take on the world. But in the autumn of 2002, her bright future was violently cut short in Vancouver, Canada. Her body, discovered stuffed in a suitcase, sent shockwaves through both Canadian and Chinese communities. The public's outrage reached a boiling point when they learned that her killer would be escorted back to China by police, protected from Canadian justice. What began as a tragic murder investigation soon spiraled into an international political storm, with diplomatic tensions rising between Canada and China. At the center of this dark story was a privileged young man named Li Ang, born into Beijing's elite on December 20th, 1983. Whispers circulated about his family's powerful connections and their ability to influence matters both in China and abroad. Unlike many of his peers who struggled for opportunities, Li Ang's path was paved with privilege. His parents' wealth opened doors, including the chance to study in Canada, a dream many Chinese students could only imagine. In February 2002, at 18, he enrolled at Simon Fraser University to study computer science. His cousin Zheng Han, 19, joined him, and together, they rented a basement apartment in East Vancouver for $600 Canadian monthly. The cousins quickly developed a reputation among their neighbors and classmates. Their apartment became notorious, a chaotic space where empty takeout containers competed for space with mountains of unwashed clothes. The smell often drifted into the hallway, causing other tenants to complain to the building manager. Yet this bachelor chaos was about to change with the arrival of someone special. In July 2002, Zhao Wei entered their lives, bringing order to their messy world. Unlike Li Ang, she came from a modest Beijing family who had sacrificed everything to send their daughter abroad. Her academic excellence had opened doors. She'd arrived in Canada on July 31st, 2001, earning a place at Kwantlen Polytechnic University to study English. When she and Liang began dating, their friends saw them as an unlikely but perfect match, her discipline balancing his carefree nature. But beneath this seemingly perfect romance, tensions were brewing. On October 9th, 2002, at 11 p.m., Li Ang's panicked voice echoed through the local police station's phone lines. His girlfriend had left for a quick grocery run at 8 p.m., he claimed, just to buy cooking oil from the nearby supermarket. The store was barely a 3-minute walk away. Hours had passed, and despite searching the neighborhood with Zheng Han, Zhao Wei had vanished into the Vancouver night. His voice trembled as he begged the police for help. But something about his story didn't quite add up. The Vancouver police responded to Liang's call with practiced professionalism, though perhaps too much routine. "Sir, most missing persons return home within hours," the dispatcher explained, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "Standard procedure requires us to wait 24 hours before filing an official report." Still, something about this case should have raised red flags. A young foreign student alone at night in an unfamiliar city. October 10th arrived with no sign of Zhao Wei. Li Ang's second call to the police carried more urgency, his voice cracking as he begged them to act. Finally, with the mandatory waiting period over, the investigation began. Detectives interviewed everyone in Zhao Wei's circle, her classmates, teachers, and of course Li Ang and Zhang Han. The interviews painted a picture of a normal young couple. They had their little fights, recalled a close friend of Zhao Wei's, but what couple doesn't? During a televised press conference, Li Ang's performance seemed perfect, perhaps too perfect. Tears streamed down his face as he choked out the words, "I should have gone with her. It's all my fault." The media ate it up, portraying him as the devastated boyfriend. Local Chinese students organized search parties, putting up posters across Vancouver's streets. The police's initial search of the apartment revealed nothing obvious, though later, they would question whether they'd been thorough enough. Despite Liang being the last person to see Zhao Wei, investigators publicly cleared him as a suspect. This hasty announcement would later come back to haunt the department. Then came October 20th, 2002, 11 days into the investigation. A hiker at Stave Lake, about an hour's drive east of Vancouver, noticed something that seemed out of place, a large suitcase partially hidden among the brush. The smell hit him first. Inside, police found a horrifying sight. A young woman's body, contorted to fit the confined space, her bare feet telling a story of a violent end. DNA confirmation came swiftly. It was Zhao Wei. The missing person case transformed into a homicide investigation, sending shockwaves through Vancouver's international student community. That night, police returned to Liang's apartment with a search warrant, this time looking for evidence of murder rather than clues to a disappearance. During a 3-hour interrogation, Liang dropped what seemed like a bombshell. 3 months before her death, Zhao Wei had allegedly told him about a mysterious stalker who followed her home from university. But seasoned detectives noticed something odd. Liang's demeanor remained unusually calm as he described this potential threat to his girlfriend, almost as if he'd rehearsed the story. The investigation was about to take a dramatic turn as inconsistencies in Liang's perfect boyfriend narrative began to surface. Behind the tears and public displays of grief, a darker truth was emerging. The alleged stalker story began to unravel under scrutiny. According to Liang, this mysterious man had approached Zhao Wei with compliments, following her until she threatened to call police. But something felt off about his account. He couldn't describe the stalker's appearance, provide any specific dates, or explain why neither he nor Zhao Wei had reported such a serious incident when it happened. The media frenzy intensified after the suitcase discovery. Reporters camped outside Liang's apartment, hoping to catch a glimpse of the grieving boyfriend. But they noticed a striking change in his behavior. The emotional young man who had sobbed on camera was gone, replaced by someone eerily detached. When asked about Zhao Wei, his answers became evasive, his eyes avoiding the cameras that had once captured his tears. The morning of October 23rd brought the case's most chilling revelation. In a crowded press conference room, the lead detective cleared his throat before delivering the news. The autopsy confirms Ms. Zhao died by strangulation. There were clear ligature marks around her neck. The room fell silent. This wasn't a random act of violence. Someone had looked into Zhao Wei's eyes as they took her life. But the most shocking turn was yet to come. That same afternoon, as Vancouver was still processing the brutal details of Zhao Wei's death, airport security cameras captured a familiar face, Li Ang, calmly walking through the terminal with packed bags. He hadn't informed the police of his travel plans despite being central to their investigation. It seemed he had prepared for this departure well in advance. 2 officers intercepted him at the gate. Li Ang's explanation came too smoothly, too rehearsed. His student visa was expiring, he claimed, and he needed to return to China for renewal. In a decision that would haunt the Vancouver Police Department for years to come, they accepted his story without verification. Not only did they let him proceed to his flight, but they also provided him an escort to the plane, effectively helping a potential murder suspect flee the country. The sight of Canadian police officers accompanying Li Ang onto his Beijing-bound flight sent shockwaves through Vancouver's community. Local news stations broadcast the footage repeatedly. Li Ang walking freely through the airport, officers flanking him like bodyguards rather than investigators. Chinese international students held vigils for Zhao Wei, demanding answers. How could someone under investigation for such a brutal crime be allowed to leave the country so easily? Behind the scenes, questions swirled about potential diplomatic pressures and the influence of Li Ang's well-connected family. The decision to let him depart would soon spark an international controversy and raise serious questions about justice, privilege, and the complex dynamics between Canadian law enforcement and foreign nationals. The Vancouver Police Department's defense of their actions rang hollow. We had insufficient evidence to detain him, they claimed, but the public saw through this excuse. By October 23rd, they had a strangled victim, a suspicious boyfriend who was the last to see her alive, and a hastily planned departure, more than enough to hold someone for questioning. The decision to let Li Ang leave sparked protests outside police headquarters and heated debates in local government meetings. On the day of Zhao Wei's cremation, November 15th, the weight of public outrage finally forced the police to acknowledge their failures. In a somber press conference, they admitted to a breakdown in departmental communication and serious lapses in judgment, but their promises to improve investigation protocols came too late for Zhao Wei. Then came the breakthrough that would change everything. On October 30th, 2002, Zhang Han walked into the police station carrying the burden of a secret he could no longer bear. His hands trembling, he began to unravel the true events of that fatal day. I came home around 4:30 that afternoon, Zhang Han testified. I heard them arguing, Li Ang and Zhao Wei. It wasn't unusual, so I went to my room. He paused, his voice catching. But around 7:30, everything changed. Li Ang burst into my room, crying, hysterical. He said she was dead. What followed was a story so bizarre it challenged belief. According to Zhang Han, Li Ang claimed it all started with a nap. Zhao Wei had awakened from a nightmare, one where Li Ang was unfaithful. In her distressed state, dream and reality blurred. She began accusing him of real infidelity, the argument escalating beyond their usual spats. Zhang Han described asking repeatedly how Zhao Wei had died, but Li Ang dodged the question, his evasiveness speaking volumes. I wanted to call an ambulance, Zhang Han admitted, guilt heavy in his voice. But Li Ang said it was too late, that we'd both be in trouble. He kept saying there was only one way out. In the following hours, the cousins embarked on a grim task. They carefully placed Zhao Wei's body into a suitcase, drove to Stave Lake, and staged an elaborate disappearance. The premeditated nature of their cover-up, from the fake story about buying cooking oil to Li Ang's tearful media appearances, revealed a calculated attempt to mislead investigators. Zhang Han's confession exposed not just the truth about Zhao Wei's death, but also the complex dynamics of family loyalty that had initially kept him silent. His decision to come forward, though delayed, would prove crucial in understanding the full scope of the tragedy. But with Li Ang already safely in China, the path to justice had become considerably more complicated. Zhang Han's arrest on December 2nd marked a turning point, but not the one justice demanded. Behind bars, guilt gnawed at him relentlessly. In a moment of remorse, he penned a letter to Zhao Wei's parents, concluding with, "I'm sorry," written 60 times, each repetition more desperate than the last. The response from Zhao Wei's parents cut straight to the heart. "Can sorry bring back our daughter?" Their words echoed the hollow nature of apologies in the face of irreversible loss. Yet just 10 days later, Zhang Han walked free on a $90,000 bail, while somewhere in Beijing, Li Ang continued his life untouched by consequences. The wheels of justice turned slowly, agonizingly so. It wasn't until June 10th, 2004, nearly 2 years after Zhao Wei's death, that Zhang Han finally faced trial. But what should have been a moment of accountability became instead a masterclass in legal technicality. The trial's crucial turning point came through a shocking revelation. The Vancouver police had placed an undercover officer in Zhang Han's cell, posing as an inmate to extract a confession. While this tactic had proven successful in previous cases, this time it would spectacularly backfire. Zhang Han's defense team seized upon this investigative overreach, arguing it violated their client's fundamental right to silence. The judge's decision sent ripples through the Canadian legal community. Despite Zhang Han's earlier voluntary confession and documented involvement in disposing of Zhao Wei's body, the judge ruled the undercover operation had tainted the evidence. With Li Ang, the primary suspect, safely beyond reach in China, the court found insufficient grounds to convict Zhang Han. In a bitter twist of fate, Zhang Han returned to his studies in Canada, his life seemingly unchanged while Zhao Wei's family grappled with an ever-deepening wound. The media dubbed Li Ang and Zhang Han the best actors in a crime drama, their carefully constructed lies and subsequent escapes from justice playing out like a well-scripted thriller. Except this was horrifyingly real. Back in Beijing, Zhao Wei's parents continued their heartbreaking campaign for justice. Their letters to the Canadian government grew more desperate with each passing month, each envelope carrying the weight of their grief and the hope that someone, somewhere, would finally hold their daughter's killer accountable. But as days turned to weeks and weeks to months, justice seemed increasingly out of reach, trapped somewhere between two nations' competing legal systems and political interests. The case's focus shifted to Beijing, where Li Ang had fled. In February 2003, acting on Canada's request, Beijing police arrested him. China asked Canada for evidence to prosecute, a simple request that should have moved justice forward. Instead, it revealed how a murder investigation could become entangled in international politics. In a baffling turn, Canada, the very nation that had requested Li Ang's arrest, now refused to share their evidence. The reasoning exposed deep rifts in international criminal justice. Canadian officials insisted the crime occurred on their soil, demanding Li Ang's return for trial. Members of Parliament argued passionately that sharing evidence with China would undermine Canadian sovereignty. China countered with its own logic. Both victim and suspect were Chinese citizens, making it their right to prosecute. The case became a diplomatic tug of war, with Zhao Wei's justice caught in the middle. Without an extradition treaty between the two countries, legal paths forward seemed increasingly narrow. On May 12, 2003, Canadian authorities charged Li Ang with second-degree murder, a hollow gesture since he remained safely in Beijing. Without Canada's evidence, Chinese authorities had no choice but to release him on bail. Even China's request to send investigators to Vancouver to examine the crime scene met with Canadian refusal. As months turned to years, the case that had once dominated headlines began to fade from public memory. But in a modest Beijing apartment, two parents couldn't forget. Zhao Wei's mother and father wrote letter after letter to Canadian police, to justice officials, to anyone who might listen. Their pleas for justice disappeared into bureaucratic silence. By August 2007, 5 years had passed since their daughter's murder. The case might have remained buried in diplomatic deadlock if not for Chinese-Canadian MP Guan Huijin and 3 colleagues. They organized a press conference that reignited public interest, launching a petition campaign that would force both governments to confront their failures. Behind the political maneuvering lay a simple truth. A young woman's killer walked free because two nations couldn't or wouldn't find a way to work together. The case highlighted how international justice could fail when political pride took precedence over human life. For Zhao Wei's family, caught between two unyielding systems, justice seemed an ever-receding horizon. The pain Zhao Wei's parents endured was beyond measure, losing a child, then watching years pass without justice. Each morning brought fresh heartbreak, each night new frustration. But hope arrived through MP Guan Huijin and Vancouver's Chinese community, who rallied behind the grieving family. Through community fundraising, Zhao Wei's parents finally secured Canadian visas. On October 6, 2008, they arrived in Vancouver, their daughter's final home. In emotional meetings with Canada's Ministers of Foreign Affairs and Justice, they weren't just grieving parents, but advocates for their daughter's memory. Their determination moved mountains. Canada finally agreed to share evidence with China, with one condition: Li Ang would be spared the death penalty, honoring Canada's 1976 abolition of capital punishment. But while diplomats negotiated, Li Ang was crafting his escape. He changed his name to Li Jiaming, married Yuan Ruishui, and started a family, 2 children who would never know their father's dark past. He seemed to be living the perfect life, protected by his family's influence and his own calculated cunning. Then, like smoke, the family vanished. Beijing police refused to give up. Their investigation led them to Tibet, where Li Ang had sought refuge in its remote landscapes. Perhaps he thought distance could quiet his conscience, that the mountains could shield him from justice. But on a July day in 2009, Tibet police proved him wrong, arresting him for intentional homicide. The case finally reached Beijing No. 1 Intermediate People's Court On September 20th, 2011, the court ordered closed proceedings. No media, no public, just family members and legal teams. The contrast between the families was stark. Li Ang's parents hired China's most celebrated criminal defense attorney, while Zhao Wei's family relied on basic legal representation and their unwavering faith in justice. The courtroom on day one crackled with tension. Witnesses described explosive confrontations between the families, raw emotions bursting through the formal legal proceedings. 9 years had passed since Zhao Wei's murder, but time hadn't dulled the pain or the demand for justice. This wasn't just a murder trial anymore. It had become a test of Chinese justice, a reflection on privilege versus truth, and most importantly, a grieving family's last hope for some measure of peace. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Li Ang's father rose from the gallery shouting about his son's innocence, while his mother accused investigators of fabricating evidence. But the prosecutor methodically dismantled their claims, presenting an ironclad case. Zhang Han's damning testimony, DNA evidence from Zhao Wei's body, and the suitcase that had become her makeshift coffin. After a year of proceedings on September 27, 2012, justice seemed to prevail. Li Ang received a life sentence for intentional homicide, lost his political rights permanently, and was ordered to pay Zhao Wei's parents 1.3 million yuan in compensation. His mother's wails echoed through the courtroom as she vowed to appeal. The appeal hearing on December 4, 2012, brought a shocking twist. Li Ang changed his story completely. Yes, he killed Zhao Wei, he admitted, but it was all a tragic accident, a playful pillow fight gone wrong. He claimed she suffocated accidentally, a story that directly contradicted the forensic evidence showing clear signs of strangulation. Then came June 30th, 2014, a day that would haunt Zhao Wei's family forever. In a decision that stunned legal experts, the court accepted Li Ang's new version of events. The intentional homicide conviction crumbled, replaced by a negligent manslaughter charge. His life sentence transformed into a mere 7 years, though the compensation order remained. But the story wasn't over. By 2016, Li Ang walked free, his time served, including pre-trial detention, meaning he spent less than 2 years actually imprisoned for taking a young woman's life. The promised compensation to Zhao Wei's family remained unpaid, another bitter pill in their long journey for justice. Then in 2023, Li Ang's name reappeared, this time in the New Zealand Herald. His photo, published for all to see, raised disturbing questions about a justice system that had allowed a convicted killer to slip away so easily. His brief imprisonment, effectively less than 2 years for ending a promising young life, seemed to mock the very concept of justice. The case exposed how privilege, legal maneuvering, and a malleable justice system could transform a clear case of murder into something barely more serious than an accident. Meanwhile, somewhere in Beijing, Zhao Wei's parents still waited for compensation that would never come, their daughter's memory overshadowed by a system that had failed them at every turn. The whispers in Chinese media painted a simple picture. Li Yang had moved to New Zealand because he couldn't find work in China. But anyone who knew the Li family's influence would have laughed at such a naive explanation. With their connections stretching from Beijing's corridors of power to the bustling business districts of Shanghai, finding a job would have been as easy as making a phone call. Money? The Li family fortune could have supported him for several lifetimes. The truth was far more complex. He was running from his past, from shadows that grew longer with each passing day in China. His first attempt to start fresh in New Zealand as Li Jiming crashed against the wall of his criminal record. But the Li family had built their empire on solving impossible problems. Soon, a new identity blossomed on paper, Li Zongyuan, complete with a different birth date and a pristine past. Like a cautious chess player testing his opponent's defenses, Li first made a strategic move to Europe in 2018, returning to China without raising any eyebrows. By June 2019, his new identity as Li Zongyuan opened New Zealand's doors. He spent those first few days like a man measuring his future home, breathing in the clean air and reveling in the blessed anonymity that New Zealand offered. No suspicious glances, no whispered conversations stopping when he entered a room. His wife and children followed shortly, their arrival carefully orchestrated like scenes in a well-written play. The next act opened with Li securing a student visa in November 2019, enrolling at the Southern Institute of Technology in Invercargill campus. By December 2020, the family had upgraded their setting to Auckland City Centre, where his parents' wealth secured them a luxurious home, a golden cage in paradise. But even the best crafted masks eventually start to crack. When Li Zongyuan, the man who was once Li Ang, applied for permanent residency through asylum, he wove a tale designed to tug at humanitarian heartstrings. He painted a picture of vulnerability, an unemployed student with a studying wife and two school-going children in Auckland. The masterstroke was his claim of persecution by Chinese agents allegedly targeting him for supporting Tibetan unity and embracing Christianity. The depth of Li's desperation became clear in his increasingly elaborate tales. He spun stories of Chinese agents infiltrating his daily life, claiming they had disguised themselves as his classmates and teachers. When his youngest son took an accidental fall, a common occurrence for any child, Li twisted it into evidence of sinister forces at work. But the walls of his carefully constructed narrative were about to crumble. New Zealand immigration's investigation uncovered the truth like peeling layers of an onion. The rejection of his previous visa application under the name Li Jiaming was just the first revelation. When confronted by the New Zealand Herald, Li's response was both bold and bizarre. Not only did he deny murdering Zhao Wei, but he insisted she was still alive, hiding somewhere like a character in a mystery novel. His explanation painted their relationship as a simple romance gone wrong. She wanted to leave, couldn't find the words, and simply vanished into thin air. Immigration officials, concerned by the disconnect between reality and Li's version of events, requested a psychological assessment. His response was telling. Instead of providing professional medical documentation, he submitted a handwritten note from a church staff member with past nursing experience. It was like offering a Band-Aid for a broken bone. The story took another turn when Zhao Wei's mother, thousands of miles away, learned of Li's asylum attempt. Through Canadian MP Guan Huijin, she reached across borders to ensure her daughter's story wouldn't be forgotten. Her formal complaint letter carried the weight of a mother's grief and determination. New Zealand immigration's final report read like a detective's case file. It revealed a man who had worn identities like masks, 2 birthplaces, 3 birth dates, 4 passports, each contradiction adding another nail to the coffin of his credibility. The pattern of deception was clear as daylight. Li's response to rejection showed his true colors. "I will sue immigration. I will stay in New Zealand no matter what," he declared, his sense of entitlement echoing his privileged background. Yet somehow, he managed to gather 1,315 signatures supporting his family's stay, a testament to either his persuasive skills or people's willingness to believe a well-crafted story. The wave of support for Leong in New Zealand raised eyebrows across continents. But those who knew the full story understood that this apparent popularity wasn't born from genuine community love. Just as his escape to Tibet had been orchestrated through family connections rather than desperate circumstance, his new life in New Zealand was carefully choreographed from the start. From the moment his feet touched New Zealand soil, Liang wove himself into the fabric of pro-Tibetan independence movements. Every protest he attended, every photograph he took, was another thread in his tapestry of deception. When his asylum application crumbled, he turned to the Tibetan community in New Zealand, playing upon their sympathies like a master manipulator. The resulting petition, with its 1,315 signatures, wasn't spontaneous support. It was the fruit of seeds planted long ago. His entire journey now appears as a masterclass in contingency planning. Tibet had been his first choice, a vast, peaceful region where he could have disappeared into obscurity, waiting for memories to fade before quietly returning to mainland China. But fate had other plans. His arrest and imprisonment in Beijing merely prompted him to activate his backup strategy, student visa first, followed by a calculated plea for political asylum based on his convenient involvement with Tibetan causes. Meanwhile, Zhao Wei's parents stand witness to a cruel irony, watching their daughter's killer navigate international borders and legal systems with the ease that wealth and influence provide. They carry the heaviest burden of this story, their quest for justice seemingly always one step behind his next carefully planned move. As his case winds through judicial review, they wait, as they have been waiting since that fateful day their daughter disappeared. Justice, in its purest form, doesn't require complex interpretation. In our interconnected world, where borders become increasingly permeable for those with means, we must ask ourselves, can anyone truly escape the weight of their actions. Even if physical freedom can be bought with money and influence, what about the freedom from memory, from conscience? As darkness falls each night, does Lee find peace in his carefully constructed new life, or does Jiawei's shadow still linger in his thoughts? The story of Lee and Jiawei may not end with the satisfying clang of a jail cell door, but it echoes a universal truth. No matter how far we run, how many identities we assume, or how many borders we cross, our actions leave indelible marks on the fabric of reality. Sometimes these marks are visible in court documents and immigration files, sometimes in the grief of a family still seeking closure, and sometimes in the quiet moments when a man with multiple names must face himself in the mirror. The truth, like water, will always find its way to the surface. It's just a matter of time. 2 decades after Jiawei's murder, justice remains as elusive as the man who took her life. Lee Ang walks free in New Zealand, hiding behind yet another false identity, while Jiawei's parents still wait for the compensation they were promised. Their daughter's killer spent less than 2 years behind bars. A mockery of justice that money and influence made possible. This isn't just about one murdered student or one privileged killer who escaped punishment. It's about how wealth and connections can bend the bars of justice until they break. From Vancouver to Beijing to New Zealand, Lee Ang's story shows how someone with enough resources can literally get away with murder, changing names, crossing borders, and crafting new realities while leaving grief and broken promises in their wake. Somewhere in Beijing, 2 parents still keep their daughters' photos on their wall, still write letters demanding justice, still wait for answers that may never come. Meanwhile, their daughter's killer lives in comfort, his children growing up in a beautiful Auckland home, never knowing the dark truth about their father's past. Perhaps the most chilling lesson of this case is how easy it can be to escape the consequences of our actions if we have the right connections and enough money. But while Lee Ang may have escaped legal justice, he can never escape the truth. And neither can we forget Jiawei, the bright young woman whose life he stole. If you found this story moving, please share it. Every share helps keep Jiawei's memory alive and reminds us that true justice shouldn't have a price tag. Subscribe for more stories that expose how privilege and power can corrupt the scales of justice. Thank you for bearing witness to Jiawei's story.